This video is part 1 of a series. We'll be ranking every nation of the world in terms of power and stability. In this part, I will cover the countries of North America. Before I get into what ranking I've given each country, I think it would help if I explained my methodology. First, I'll explain what the parameters of each tier is. In other words, what is each tier's average country? The first tier is S tier. S stands for superpower. This tier is by nature exclusive, as there can only be a few global hegemons. Right now there is only one S-tier nation, the United States, but more on that later. The next tier is A tier. Expect to see nations that are regional hegemons in A tier. Think of countries like the United Kingdom or France, for example. But again, more on why those countries are A tier later. After that, we have B tier. While B tier nations might not be global powers by any means, they earn their spot by having high stability and moderate influence within their own region. An example of a B-tier nation is the Dominican Republic, but I'll explain why that is later on in this video. Moving on to C tier, or what I like to call the wildcard countries. These countries have the potential of exerting influence and maintaining stability, but there are underlying weaknesses in a C-tier nation's position that prevents it from entering the B tier. If policymakers in these nations fail to address such issues, then expect these nations to become D tier. An example of a C tier nation is Ethiopia, but as always, you'll have to wait for my Africa episode to hear my explanation. Next is D tier. These countries are on the back foot, so to say. These countries have issues which present a threat to their very existence. These nations will become F tier if they don't do anything about it. The final tier is F tier. F stands for failed state. This is pretty self-explanatory. Think of nations like Venezuela and Syria. I don't think I need to explain this much, but if you need explanation, just wait for my South America and Asia episodes. There are 8 categories I use to rank a nation's power and stability. The 8 categories are a nation's geographic security, government stability, economic stability, demographics, social stability, food independence, energy independence, and finally, their military power. I ask a series of questions for each category, and then I do research to determine how each of these countries rank in every category, assigning a score from F to S. I then take the average of these scores, and I use that value to assign the nation a tier. However, if I feel that one category may weigh more heavily than another, I may change the final tier of that nation at my discretion. To ensure that I have a consistent method for assigning a ranking in each category, I've developed a series of questions I consider when doing research on each nation. I use the findings of my research to answer each of these questions, and from that data I determine the ranking for the category. For the Geographic Security category, these are the questions I will be considering while doing my analysis. An example of an A-tier nation in this category is the United Kingdom, on account of them being an island. And an example of an F-tier country in this category is Bangladesh, on account of their terrain being completely flat and their borders being arbitrarily defined. These are the questions for government stability. An example of an A-tier nation in this category is Norway, due to their government being a stable, liberal democracy. And an example of an F-tier country in this category is Somalia, due to their government not really existing at all. These are the questions for economic stability. An example of an A-tier nation in this category is Australia, since they are a developed Western economy with stable credit and manageable debt. An example of an F-tier country in this category is the Ivory Coast, since their economy is mostly just subsistence agriculture. These are the questions for demographics. An example of an A-tier nation in this category is the United States, due to having both high levels of immigration and birth rates, while simultaneously having a growing economy. An example of an F-tier country in this category is Japan, due to having a rapidly aging population combined with a stagnant economy. These are the questions for social stability. An example of an A-tier nation in this category is Denmark, as they do not have any potential separatist regions and are easily able to assimilate immigrants into their culture due to being a Western democracy. An example of an F-tier nation in this category is Afghanistan, for obvious reasons. These are the questions for food independence. An example of an A-tier nation in this category is Argentina, since they are a net food exporter. An example of an F-tier nation in this category is Libya, since they import more than half of their food. These are the questions for energy independence. An example of an A-tier nation in this category is Saudi Arabia, for pretty obvious reasons. An F-tier nation in this category would be a country that currently does not have access to global petroleum markets. However, no country in this tier list will be an F-tier for energy independence. Every country in the world will have access to oil so long as an American carrier battle group patrols the Persian Gulf, and I don't foresee this status quo changing in the near future. These are the questions for military power, the last category I will be considering for this list. An example of an A-tier nation in this category is the United Kingdom, due to having a modernized military, powerful navy, and strong alliance network. An example of an F-tier nation in this category is Equatorial Guinea, due to the country not having a military while being in an unstable region. Alright, so now with all of that explained, we've explained how I'm ranking each of these countries and how each category is defined. Now that I've done that, I'm going to move on to ranking each of the North American countries. So, for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to explain why United States is as powerful as it is and why it's the world's only S-tier nation. If you want a more concise explanation on this, I highly recommend to check out Brain for Breakfast YouTube video, which I've linked in the description. Anyway, let me get on to it. So, starting off with Geographic Security. Okay, S tier. Why is it S tier? Want to invade America? Good luck, you have 4 choices. Alright, choice number 1. Put your army on a boat and cross 6,000 kilometers of the Atlantic Ocean, contending with the world's strongest navy all the way. Yeah, that's not working out, is it? Alright, let's look at option 2. Okay, put your army on a boat and cross 11,000 kilometers of the Pacific Ocean, contending with the world's strongest navy all the way. Okay, well, Japan tried that, and if you look at Midway, you see how that turned out. Okay, so those 2 options, crossing the ocean, obviously aren't working. Let's look at option 3. Okay, so we're going to somehow convince Canada, America's closest ally, to let you station your entire army there. Ignore the fact that America would probably have something to say about that while you cross the entire ocean to get there. Even if you get there, you'd have to make it through 400 kilometers of Appalachia until you make it to any meaningful population centers like New York or Boston. So it's not going to work, is what I'm saying. Okay, well, that wasn't working. Let's look at the 4th option, I guess. Somehow convince Mexico, who has tried its hardest for the last century to not antagonize America in any sort of war after their swift defeat in the Mexican-American War, example, the Zimmerman Telegraph during World War I, to allow you to station your entire army in their country to stage an invasion of America. Ignore the fact that America would probably have something to say about that while you cross the ocean to get there. Even if you get there, you have to make it through 400 kilometers of desert before you make it to any meaningful population centers like San Antonio, Phoenix, or Los Angeles. Well, that's not working. I guess there's a fifth option. Launch an invasion from space. Of the alternatives, this might be the most realistic. And I'm saying that completely sincerely. There's a reason why the USSR built nukes instead of ships. They realized that the prospect of invading the US with their navy was a ridiculous notion. Okay, that's geographic security pretty well covered. Government stability. Believe it or not, it's also S tier. Okay. America literally invented the concept of a modern democracy, and it is the world's oldest liberal democracy. Throughout its 2.5 centuries of history, America has only had one election where there wasn't a peaceful transition of power, the Civil War. Compare this to another liberal democracy like France, where revolution was the norm for transitioning power for a good part of history. American political institutions are basically the envy of stability. Economic stability, also an S tier. Okay, world's largest economy, pretty good. Since the Industrial Revolution, there have only been 2 instances in American history where US GDP has decreased. Yeah, America's economy is pretty stable. If you look at the 2008 recession and look at how much US GDP decreased during that time, it decreased by around, 1.5%? Now, look at that same time, the 2008 recession, which became the global financial crisis, and look at other nations. Many other nations had their GDP decrease by as much as 10% during that same time period in a US-started recession. That is how stable the US economy is. It is the only truly stable market. It is pretty much immune to instability. There is something that should be clarified, because many people will say that America's economic stability can't be S tier because it has a debt to GDP ratio of close to 100%. And I do admit that this is a potential weakness of the US economy, but this issue is way overblown for many reasons. First, let me clear up some misconceptions. No, China doesn't own every last dollar of America's $20 trillion debt. Believe it or not, there are people who believe this. They own 5% of it. They don't own this amount so that they can control the U.S. from within, as many people, as many conspiracy theorists would have you believe. They own this amount of U.S. debt to allow them to manipulate their currency to keep it weak relative to the U.S. dollar, encouraging other countries to go to China for cheap imports. In fact, combined, foreign governments only own 34% of U.S. debt. The second misconception: the U.S. debt is currently at an unsustainable level. If this were the case, then why, at other parts of its history, such as after World War II, when the debt to GDP ratio was 130%, apparently that's supposed to be unsustainable? Let me explain why it's sustainable. Because the American economy, the US dollar is the world's sole global currency. Basically, other nations are invested in the continued stability of the US economy, because without US stability in the economy, there is no global market stability. If the US economy fails, the whole world's economy fails. Example, the 2008 recession, like I said earlier. And also, the Great Depression. Remember the Weimar Republic? Yeah, that's what happened to Germany during the Great Recession. Third misconception: no, the U.S. debt is not solely the result of reckless fiscal spending. Some of the U.S. debt is actually intentionally used to manage the economy. 30% of U.S. debt is intragovernmental, meaning that 30% of U.S. debt is owed to itself. I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. The U.S. government is kind of quite a Byzantine organization. It's quite complex because of the federal system. So, for example, the U.S. government can owe money to the state governments, or it can owe money to certain departments. Yeah, 30% of U.S. debt is owed to itself. That's actually the same amount that's owed by foreign nations. That's a little crazy. But 11% of U.S. debt is owned by the Federal Reserve. This is done to manage interest rates and inflation. So that accounts for about, let's say, 70% of U.S. debt. So where is all the other debt? Well, that's actually owned by U.S. citizens. So U.S. debt is not what you consider typical. When the IMF says that a debt to GDP ratio of over 90% is unsustainable for a nation, they're talking about typical nations that aren't the world's leading economy. The debt to GDP ratio of the U.S. is actually somewhere between 70 to 85%. So, yes, still, at the end of the day, that's pretty close to the 90% threshold. But, it hasn't got there yet, and I do admit it is a problem, but it is a problem for 20 years down the road. The U.S. debt to GDP ratio will sadly get a lot higher, but it'll get a lot higher before it becomes a problem. So, because the U.S. has the largest economy and navy, the state of the U.S. economy directly influences the state of the world economy. The day the U.S. economy fails permanently, that's just game over for the world economy. So, let's hope that doesn't happen for the sake of everyone. Okay, fourth, demographics. Of the 39 developed countries in the world, only 6 are projected to have grown at all by 2050. America is one of those countries. As America was founded by immigrants, America is the country that is best able to absorb immigrants to boost the population without causing any significant social conflict in the process. U.S. has a very balanced male-to-female ratio and an even proportion of young, middle-aged, and old people. The only reason I have America as A tier demographically speaking and not S tier is because of the large size of the baby boomer generation compared to the small size of the X generation. When all of them retire, there will be a disruption in the U.S. economy, but after that, America's demographics are very enviable. Social stability. America was pretty much the first country to define its nationality as something other than its ethnicity or religion. So it's basically pioneered the idea of integration and globalization that's pretty resistant to social instability. There aren't going to be any separatist regions in America. The state of Wyoming isn't going to rise up and say, all Wyomingans are one people. That's just not happening. Food independence. America is a food exporter. Pretty self-explanatory. That's the largest river system on the planet, and all of it is over fertile land. And, of course, that river system is the Mississippi River system. Energy independence. America recently became energy independent. And as a nation that went through the 1970s oil embargo, through wars in the Middle East to prevent the oil market from collapsing, and all that history, it's kind of hard to believe that as of 2019, America became a net oil exporter. Why? How did this happen? Where did this change come from? The shale revolution. Hydraulic fracturing gave America the technology to access its oil reserves that were previously untappable. And even without all that, America's Navy is largest in the world. If America still needed to import 100% of its oil even, it still would be able to, just because of its Navy. Its Navy will always ensure that America will be able to access petroleum resources from overseas. Finally, military power. S. Okay. This is probably the most self-explanatory. Largest Navy, Air Force, highest military expenditure by far, most technologically advanced, furthest reaching, overall most powerful military on the planet, outspends the next 10 nations combined. Yeah, it's America. It's the world's most powerful military. S tier. Pretty self-explanatory. So the final ranking of America is S. Okay. Now, A tier. Actually, we only have one A-tier nation in North America, and that is Canada. Well, let me explain. Canada's Geographic Security. A tier. Very similar to America. The only issue is that they're next to America. And America is much more capable of invading Canada than Canada is capable of invading America. Granted, there was the 1812 War of 1812, but that was 200 years ago. Basically, what I'm saying is Canada is very fortunate that they are allies of America and not enemies, because that basically means that Canada has an A tier geographic security. Government stability, A tier. So obviously it's a liberal democracy, and it's a former British colony, and you'll see a theme throughout the rest of this video that former British colonies have the most stable democracies relative to other nations. So positive things are it has a liberal democracy, fair elections, and a constitution that restricts government power. Economic stability, B. That's could become as surprising since Canada has one of the highest GDPs and one of the highest GDP per capitas of any nation in the world. So why is it only B tier? Well, let's start with the positive. Canada is a part of new NAFTA, so it has easy access to American markets. It has access to both Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. So it has good access to foreign markets, overseas I mean. And it's also a highly developed country, and it has access to Arctic trade, which will come more into play as global warming happens. However, there are some negatives. So Canada's economy is similar in composition to America's. This basically means, to put a long story short, that trading with Mexico for America makes more sense than trading with Canada. However, Mexico is a developing nation, and it's mostly manufacturing-based economy compared to America's service-based economy. So those two economies integrate a lot better than America with Canada. So while Canada has access to American markets, which is becoming less and less common, this access to American markets is both a blessing and a curse, I should say. Also, another negative. Canada, a good portion of Canada's economy is dependent on petroleum exports, but this is a problem. For one, Alberta, where most of the Canadian oil comes from, the oil there is what you call bitumen, which is actually the hardest oil to refine. It costs for bitumen to make a profit, like the price of oil in dollars per barrel has to be somewhere around $80. And in today's market of low energy prices, where the price of oil currently sits at around $30 per barrel, it's quite hard for bitumen to make a profit for Canada. Of course, this is also a problem for shale oil, which is harder to refine. But the thing with shale is that the technology for shale is still developing. It's still getting cheaper and cheaper to produce. However, it's not the same story with bitumen. The technology has been around for half a century, I mean, and it hasn't really developed since then. And also, another reason why this is a problem for Canada is Canada's only means of exporting Albertan oil is through America. This is becoming more difficult as pipelines from Canada are being blocked by American lawmakers. Think of Keystone XL. Also, since America is now energy independent and now has less of a reason to want to purchase Canadian oil, so Canada has to find a new buyer. So that's why it's only B tier economically speaking. Okay, so we talked about why American demographics are good. So looking at this image, which is an image of the Canadian demographic experiment, it seems that Canada's demographics is a serious issue. As you see, there's less people in the younger generation and more people in the middle-aged generation. However, although this is a problem, Canada's immigration rate more than compensates for it. It's actually higher than America's. This means that Canada will continue to see American levels of population growth in the near future, but it's only B tier instead of A tier because of this imbalance in the population pyramid. On to social stability, C tier, the only C tier quality of Canada. Obviously, there's the issue of Quebec, and although that referendum actually failed, what happened in the process is the Canadian government wrote into the Constitution that the provinces of Canada have a right to secede if they choose to, and if they get a referendum that wins a popular vote, then they are allowed to secede from Canada. And while Quebec kind of went through their referendum and that's over, it basically means that if there are any provinces of Canada that want to secede, Canada can't do anything about it. And the thing is, Quebec isn't the only province of Canada that's looking for secession. Believe it or not, actually Alberta has a not insignificant independence movement. There was a recent poll that actually showed that 35% of Albertans are in favor of secession. And while that's not close to the 50% required, it still shows that there is potential weaknesses in the Canadian system. Canada could potentially actually fracture into multiple states. So that remains a problem for Canada, and that's why social stability in Canada is C tier, which is something that's a little uncommon for liberal democracies. But in terms of food independence, Canada is S tier. It exports over half of its food, and its food advantage will only increase as global warming pushes the Corn Belt into Canada. So energy independence, A. So Canada is safely, by a large margin, an energy exporter. However, it's not S tier. Why? Well, for what I explained earlier, bitumen is very expensive to refine, so it's A tier instead of S tier. Military power, A. Canadian interests are American security interests. As long as America is a premier superpower, Canada's independence will not be threatened by foreign powers. Simple as that. So overall, that's why Canada is an A tier nation. Alright, now, moving on to the B tier nations. Full disclosure, these are alphabetically ranked. For example, the Bahamas isn't somehow ranked above like Mexico, for example. You know, they're just in the same tier. So they're kind of just lumped in together, and I just ranked them alphabetically because it's easier to keep track of. But this isn't by any means a ranking system where Barbados is on the top of B tier and St. Lucia is on the bottom of B tier. So the first B tier nation, Antigua and Barbuda.
Antigua.
Geographic security, B. Okay, it's a Caribbean island, and I'm going to get this out of the way now because all these Caribbean islands pretty much have the same thing going on. So, positive. It's Western Hemisphere, which means that it is protected by American security guarantees. And it's also an island, so it's hard to invade. However, the negative thing is that it's a Caribbean island, and all the Caribbean islands are in a chain. So it's closer to other islands, which means that it's easier to be invaded relative to a Pacific island, for example. And also, global warming and rising sea levels, while not a threat in the next 20 years, present a long-term security issue for the geographic security of Caribbean nations. So pretty much every single Caribbean nation, without exception, is B tier. So there you go. There's the explanation. I'm not going to explain it for the rest of them. Okay, government stability. It's B tier. And actually, it's a former British colony. So really it should be A tier, but there are some human rights concerns in the nation. For example, homosexuality is criminalized. So, it could be A tier. It's getting there. It just doesn't have the same stability as a former British colony like Canada. Economic stability, B tier. It has a high GDP per capita. Its economy is mostly based off of tourism. However, you say, oh, well, why is it in the same tier as Canada? Well, the thing is, economic stability is relative. Even if Canada is a richer nation and has more economic influence than Antigua and Barbuda,
Antigua,
they're in the same tier because economic stability is relative. Basically, economic stability more should be looked at as a ranking of what GDP growth will look like in the future. So demographics is C tier. It actually looks similar to America, but economic development is less than America, and immigration is much lower. Antigua and Barbuda's
Antigua,
demographics goes in C tier. Social stability for former British colony. Not much to say here, honestly. So it's not impervious to conflict, but it's really too small for there to be any concerns about separatism. Food independence, C. It imports a good portion of its food because it's an island nation, but it's in the Western Hemisphere, so it has access to the food exporting nations of America and Canada. Energy independence, D. Completely dependent on imported fossil fuels for energy. Okay, that's not much else to say there. Military power, B. Not much to say either. Its army is adequate and its security is pretty much guaranteed by America. There you go. That's the first Caribbean island. Honestly, Caribbean islands are not the most interesting to look at. In terms of geopolitics, mind you, they are great vacation spots. But, geopolitically speaking, there's not much going on there. So, I'm mostly going to be quick with the rest of these island nations. For example, the Bahamas, Geographic Security, B. C. Antigua and Barbuda for Y. Government stability, A. Former British colony, there you go. Economic stability, B. Higher GDP per capita than Antigua and Barbuda. Tourism and offshore banking account for most of its GDP, there you go. There's your quick economic facts. Demographics, C. It's quite similar to the other island nation, Antigua and Barbuda. Social stability, B. Same story. Food independence, C. Same story. Energy independence, D. Same story. Military power, exactly the same. Okay, good. We covered that. The only thing that was different was government stability. Okay, Barbados. Here we go. B. Same story. Government stability. A. Former British colony. Also similar to the Bahamas. Same story. Economic stability. B. Tourism and offshore banking. Like pretty much all these Caribbean islands, that's its economy. Demographics. C. Same story. Social stability. Same story there. Food independence. Actually is D. It imports slightly more than the Bahamas, so that's interesting. Energy independence, D. Military power, B. Okay, there we go. Nice. Belize. This is a Central American nation, and pretty much what you see here is there's a few winners in Central America and a lot of losers. Belize is one of the winners. So let's start with the bad. Is geographic security is C. It's in the Western Hemisphere and it has a rainforest buffer on its borders, but it is very flat. And that means that it's threatened by global warming and invading armies. But government stability, it's B. It is a former British colony, which is good, but the government is relatively young, so it's only B. Economic stability is C. It is a developing country, right? So that it's kind of hard for a developing country's economy to be stable, to be perfectly honest. But it's actually more stable than the other countries of Central America, so C is kind of a win when it comes to that. Demographics, A. It's actually at the edge of phase 2 in the demographics transition model. So the economy is strong for where Belize is in that demographic transition model. Social stability, it's B. Small Latin American state, but as a former British colony, social tension's a little better than its neighbors, just because it's hard to explain, so I'll just explain it here. Why I'll explain here why British colonies generally have better social stability than Spanish colonies. Basically, the Spanish had something called the encomienda system. Basically, it's where you had different rights depending on if you were a peninsulari, a mulattoes, a mestizos, or an indigenous person. Peninsulari is a first generation immigrants from Spain, and basically it's the Spaniards. What the Spanish did is they pretty much had no women colonists, so basically all the people that were born in Spanish colonies were mixed race between either Native Americans and white settlers, or slaves brought over from Africa. So the mestizos are the mixed race between Native American and Spaniards, and the mulattoes are the mixed race between the slaves brought over from Africa and the Spaniards. Then the fourth category is just Native Americans, or the indigenous people. So basically, the Spanish set up a system where you had certain rights depending on what your racial identification was. If you were a peninsulari, you basically were the governors of the colony. They weren't there to stay permanently, but they had the most rights. Then the people with less rights were the people who were less Spanish. So basically the mixed race people. However, this system didn't die away when Spanish colonies declared independence. Its legacy still exists today, and basically that's why I'm going to be ranking all these former Spanish colonies, for the most part, as C tier in terms of social stability, whereas most of the former British colonies are B tier because those institutions pretty much were not as prevalent, and they were mostly abolished when these colonies gained independence. So that's why social stability in these Latin American states that are former British colonies is, well, I guess they're technically not Latin American, sorry. Social stability in these colonies in North America that are former British colonies is B tier. Social stability in these former colonies that were former Spanish colonies is actually C tier. So that tangent over, that's why Belize has a social stability of B tier, whereas most of the other Central American nations have a social stability of C tier because of those problems with institutionalized racism in those countries. Okay, on to food independence for Belize. That is D tier. They import most of their food. Okay, energy independence. C. They're actually heavily a net oil importer, but offshore oil was recently discovered. And keep in mind, C is more of a wild card category than an actual ranking. So what I'm saying is, since offshore oil was discovered, Belize has the potential to become an energy exporter if they develop that. And military power is B. Not much to say there, because of they're in the Western Hemisphere, yada yada yada. So all that put together, they are B tier. Now on to Costa Rica, another one of the winners in Central America in terms of geopolitics. Their geographic security is B. Not much to say there. Look at them on a map. They're pretty secure. They have the jungle. They only border 2 nations, and they have good relations with Panama. And Nicaragua, not so much. But still, geographic security is all right. It's B tier. Government stability, A. So, actually, Costa Rica is a former Spanish colony and not a former British colony. So you'd expect them to, following the rule, that they would actually have a pretty unstable government. But they're actually kind of become the gold standard of stability in Central America. there's actually been fair elections and peaceful transition of power since 1948, which is a seriously good record. Economic stability is B. It's a diverse, service-based economy. It's pretty good. It's not impervious to global instability, but, it's a pretty good economy. They've got a good economy going on there. Demographics is B. They have a growing population and a growing economy. Those two things put together means a B-tier demographics. Social stability is A. Same deal with government stability. Social unrest and internal conflicts is pretty rare throughout Costa Rica's history, which is, again, unusual for a former Spanish colony. So, really, I'd say Costa Rica was kind of dealt the same hand that many of the other Central American nations were, but they played it much better. Food independence, however, is D. They're a tropical nation. Again, they import most of their food. Energy independence, however, is B. Why? Because 97% of Costa Rican power is actually renewable. But at the end of the day, like I was explaining earlier, they still have to import oil because of transportation and manufacturing purposes. But since Costa Rica is close to Colombia, a net oil exporter, they don't really have to worry about their energy. So that's why it's B tier, even though they're a net oil importer, which is unusual. I don't usually put net oil importers anywhere above C tier. Military power, D. Yeah, the one weakness of Costa Rica is they literally do not have a military. None whatsoever. Not even like a navy, which some nations that don't have militaries have a navy. So why is Costa Rica not an F tier? Well, Costa Rica's independence is pretty much guaranteed by America. So that's not a huge security issue, but still, it could be a long-term security issue if that American guarantee of independence ever changes. Okay, on to the next country, the Dominican Republic. Geographic security is B. It borders Haiti, but it is the more powerful of the two nations, so basically it follows the same rules as all the other Caribbean island nations. Government stability, C. It was a former Spanish colony, which for the reasons I explained earlier is not typically a good thing, because Spain usually values more monarchy and hierarchical values than democracy, so that's not good for your government stability. In fact, there was a civil war in the Dominican Republic in the 60s, and there was an unstable, oppressive communist government until 1978. But when Balaguer exited power, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. I have not learned Spanish, so I'm pretty iffy on that pronunciation. But when he left power, there were reforms made, and elections have been fair since 1992. So it remains to be seen if the Dominican Republic can become a stable country in terms of its government. But it's things are on an upward trend there. So it's only C tier for now, but I could see it upgrading to B and ultimately A in the future. Economic stability is B, however. It's actually the largest economy in Central and Caribbean America. Its GDP per capita is moderately high at 8,000, which is pretty good. And its service-based economy, it has a service-based economy. And this economy is gradually supplanting the raw materials economy that it used to have. Demographics, it's A. Growing population and growing economy, which is a very good combination, even more so than Costa Rica, so that's why it's A tier in terms of demographics. Social stability is B. There's no recent history of ethnic, religious, or social conflict. However, at the end of the day, it is a former Spanish colony, so that could present an issue in the future, but it hasn't so far for the Dominican Republic. Food independence, however, is D. So, although agriculture actually accounts for a good portion of its GDP, the Dominican Republic produces crops for export that aren't really staple foods, such as sugar and, well, mostly sugar, honestly. It's a Caribbean island. But yeah, basically, although it is agriculture accounts for its GDP, it is D tier in terms of food independence because that agriculture can't be used to sustain its population. And also, energy independence. Also D, it's a net energy importer. However, 14% of power comes from renewables, which is pretty good, but still not enough to put it anywhere higher than D tier. Military power, just B, not much to say there. Okay, on to Jamaica, another former British colony. Geographic security is B. I explained why earlier. C, Antigua and Barbuda. Government stability is C, actually, which is unusual since it's a former British colony, but it's been surprisingly unstable in recent years, and there was actually a poll recently, and it said that 60% of Jamaicans believe that they would have been better off if their country stayed a colony of the UK, and that just kind of gives a window into how many Jamaicans feel about their stability of the government there, at least. And actually only 14% would oppose being a part of Britain again. So, yeah, very interesting situation there. The government is not as stable as it could be. However, economically speaking, they're B tier. It's mostly service-based and it's a middle-income economy. Tourism is the main factor, and so on. Demographics, B. It has a growing population and growing economy. Social stability, B. For the reasons I explained earlier, it's a former British colony. Food independence, D. It's pretty much the same as all the other Caribbean nations, but one thing I should note is Jamaica used to be an exporter of sugar, and now it actually imports sugar, which is a little ironic, wouldn't you say? Energy independence is D. Most energy comes from petroleum, and it is a net energy importer, not a good combination for energy independence. Military power, however, is B, for the reasons I explained earlier. Mexico. Geographic security is B. Oh wait, hold on. This isn't actually a relevant nation. Sorry, all the other Caribbean nations, but this is actually a pretty interesting nation to analyze, so I'll slow down a bit here. Okay. Geographic security for Mexico is B. Why? Well, there's jungles on the eastern end of the country, so that's pretty good. There's desert on the northern end of the country, so that's pretty good. Capital surrounded by mountains, pretty good. Why isn't it an A tier then? Well, the world's only superpower is on Mexico's northern border, and Mexico doesn't quite have the same historical ties to America that Canada does, if you remember the Mexican-American War. Or the French invasion of Mexico. Yeah, not the best of relations. And while conflict between the two nations is unlikely, it remains a factor that Mexican policymakers have to consider. Government stability is C. Yeah, corruption and bribery are pretty determinant in the Mexican government. The government is dysfunctional, has many issues, but at least it's stable. And the people who profit off of the government's corruption have an interest in maintaining the status quo. So, yeah, it's not D tier or anything, but yeah, the government there is not the best. Economic stability, C. For the reasons I said in government stability, it's because of bribery and corruption. It's kind of hard to do legitimate business in Mexico. However, it's at the end of the day, being next to America and having access to American markets is pretty good. So I think they have the potential to really help increase their economic prosperity in the future. Demographics is B. It's a growing economy and a growing nation. However, they do lose a lot of people to immigration, unfortunately, for Mexico at least. That's very good for America because we benefit off of those immigrants, but in Mexico, they lose a lot of people that go over the northern border. So that's kind of a threat to the population growth of Mexico. Um, in terms of social stability, it's C, former Spanish colony, has the same issues, and it's also a larger nation, so separatism is not a complete joke like it is in other former Spanish colonies that are just so decentralized. Like after nations like Grand Colombia fell apart. Food independence is D. It's a net food importer. Not much to say there. Energy independence is A. It is a net energy exporter. Pretty good, but in terms of military power, it is B because it is not as close to the United States as Canada is at the end of the day. And while it does have a military, it is not exerting any global influence or anything, so it is only B. Alright, on to Panama. Geographic security is B. Eastern border is secure. That's the border with Colombia, because there's no connections by land. No roads, no railroads, or anything. Very hard to invade from there. Northern border is secure. Guess why? They border Costa Rica, and if we remember, Costa Rica does not have a military. So that's pretty good. That's B tier. Government stability. C. They're a former Spanish colony, and the government there is pretty new. It's a relatively young democracy after Operation Just Cause by America overthrew the previous government there and put in a democracy. And the new government was pretty unstable at first, but since then it's gradually improved and brought about consistent and fair elections. Economically speaking, its stability is B. There's something unique about Panama, and it's a giant canal. The world's only, other than going around all the way around South America, it's the only way to get between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans directly, without going through the Indian Ocean first. So that is a huge part of Panama's economy. Very important. And it's allowed Panama to find prosperity that is abnormal for Central American nations. Like I said, any of the Central American nations that are B tier are the winners of Central America. It also has the highest GDP per capita in Central America. Very good. However, since Panama is dependent on international trade for its survival, and as we said earlier, depending on international trade is by nature unstable, it can only be B tier instead of A tier, even though it is a very wealthy nation compared to the rest of Central America. Demographics in Panama is actually A tier. It has a rapidly growing population and a rapidly growing economy, which is very good. Social stability is C, very diverse nation, and there's no history of ethnic conflict. However, there is extremely high wealth inequality, and that is always going to cause social unrest if there are people living below the poverty line. The United States is kind of an exception to that because the poor in America are still rich compared to the rest of the world, but when there's wealth inequality in developing nations, it is a bigger source of social unrest. Food independence is a D. It is a net food importer. Most of the food comes from the United States, actually. In energy independence, it is a C tier nation, because 40% of power is actually hydroelectric, which is alright, but the rest is from oil. But since it's right next to Colombia, and that oil exporter, which is good for it. However, it's not quite as good as Costa Rica, which has 97% renewable power. So it is unfortunately only C tier instead of B tier. Military power, D. Also, literally, it does not have a military. Not even a single soldier. Not even a navy. Just does not have a military compared to Costa Rica. So that's not good. But overall, it's a B tier nation still. Pretty good country. St. Lucia. literally have nothing to say about this. Geographic security, B, explains why. Government stability, B, it's a former British colony. Economic stability, B, it's pretty stable. It's like a tax haven and tourism, pretty standard for a Caribbean nation. It's demographics, it's C, pretty standard for a Caribbean nation. Social stability, it is B, former British colony. Food independence, C, it's a Caribbean nation, imports most of its food. Energy independence, B. Military power is D. It does not have a military. Okay, on to the next one. That was another B tier nation. Next B tier nation is Trinidad and Tobago, the last B tier nation, but not the worst B tier nation. Actually, I'd say it's pretty high up there in B tier, if I had to rank them. That is because it is geographic security is B, same reasons. Government stability is B, former British colony. There was an unsuccessful coup attempt in 1990, but that is the only instance of political instability. Economic stability is B. It's pretty good. Demographics, C. It could use some improvement. Social stability is B. Same reasons. Food independence, D. But this is the real kicker. This is the reason why I think Trinidad and Tobago is a pretty successful in terms of a Caribbean nation. It is a net oil exporter. It is A tier in terms of energy independence, which is very good, especially since most of the other Caribbean nations do not have access to oil. Military power, B, that's all. And on to C tier. C for Cuba, our first C tier nation. Geographic security is B, same reason as stated before. But the government stability is D, our first D tier government stability on this list. It is a corrupt communist dictatorial regime, not a very good combination at all. So that is not very good because most communist governments have failed in the past. There's only a few of them left in the world, and Cuba is one of them. And that's not good. But economic stability is actually C. The Cuban economy relied mostly on foreign aid in the past, and actually there was a crisis in the early 90s when the government decided to stop receiving foreign aid from America. That was a disaster, so they decided to continue. And right now they receive most of their foreign aid from China, actually. So all of that sounds pretty bad, right? Why is it C tier? Well, it's actually a mixed economy, between planned and market, and it's transitioning towards a market economy. It's opening up. There are reforms in the countries, and things are looking up for the future. So it's C tier, wildcard nation, because they could either, go the way of Russia in the 90s and have a free economy, or they could go the way of China right now, where they actually transitioned back to a mostly planned economy and kind of tightened down on the opening up that used to happen. So let's hope that they keep opening up their economy, because that would be good for that nation. Demographics is D. It actually looks similar to Canada's demographic pyramid, but Cuba does not have the luxury of receiving immigrants. Actually, most of the people in Cuba it has a very high net immigration rate because, it's a corrupt regime and people are trying to get out of there. That's why there's a lot of Cubans that immigrate to America. But in social stability is C. It's mostly stable. It's a former Spanish colony, however. But human rights abuses are a major concern there. Food independence is F. It is heavily a food importer. But Cuba decided to antagonize the one country it makes the most sense to import food from, obviously being America. But, they just, like I said earlier, there was a famine in the 1990s, but Cuba refused to receive any foreign aid from America. It's just, because of ideology, it's kind of influenced the decisions of policymakers there, and it's turned out to be very negative. So, overall, it is a C tier nation. It has some qualities that are better than Caribbean nations. For example, It is larger in size. Well, that's really about it. But has the potential to become a better country, but if correct policy decisions were made, of course. However, it is a wild card country because it could also go the other way and actually turn out for the worse. Okay, next C tier nation, Dominica, another Caribbean island. So it has a geographic security in the B tier, of course. But the government stability is actually C because it's a young democracy with no term limits and 2 attempted coups in 1981. Not a good recipe for a stable government. However, in terms of economic stability, it is a C tier nation in terms of economic stability. It is mostly dependent on agriculture. However, it is expanding to the financial services sector, which is why it is C tier, because it is a wild card country. It could, see further growth in the future if that is a successful move, or it could cause instability in the nation, which is why it's C tier, like I said. Demographics, though, is C. It has a slowing population growth, and the economy is still developing. Social stability is C. It's a former sugar colony. Most of its population is descended from former slaves. It's pretty standard stuff for a Caribbean island country. But it also had recent political instability, so that's why it's C tier instead of B tier. Food independence is C, standard stuff. Energy independence is C, standard stuff. I think they get some of their power from renewables, which is good. Military power is C, and that is a wrap. That is another C tier nation, Dominica. Next nation is El Salvador. Geographic security is C. Because it is a Central American nation. The borders are not quite natural. It has hilly terrain, which is good, but at the end of the day, it is kind of a small country and it's a little bit easier to invade. Government stability. C. There was a civil war throughout all of the 80s. That is never good. However, there has been a stable government since that ended, so that is good. So that's why it's C. Economic stability, though, is D. It is in trouble with the IMF. It is a mono-export economy, which means that it only exports... its economy is pretty much based off of the export of raw material, so that is not good. It has had consistently low GDP growth for the past 2 decades, actually one of the lowest in Central America, and overall, a D tier economy. And demographics is C, pretty standard. It's a growing population, but it's also not a growing economy, so it's kind of, it's mixed bag. But social stability is C. It's a former Spanish colony. What else can you say? Food independence, though, is D. It imports its food. I don't know. Really don't have anything else to say. Energy independence is also D, and its military power is C. Its military is, okay, not the best. I've seen better. So that's why it is a C tier nation, which is actually okay for a Central American nation, to tell the truth. When we get to D tier, which is every one of the D tier nations is actually a Central American nation, we'll see what I mean by saying that a C tier is actually kind of good for a Central American nation. It is a pretty average nation when it comes to it. If it fixes its economy, it could maybe bump itself up to B tier, but right now it's a C tier nation. Grenada. Geographic security is B. It's a Caribbean island. Government stability is C. Socialist government. Overthrown by America. It had its socialist government overthrown by America in 1983. Obviously, having your government overthrown is not the best, but there has been democratic elections since then. So that's why this nation is C tier instead of B tier. Economic stability is B. It is mostly dependent on tourism, but its economy is pretty good aside from that. Demographics, B. Growing population and economy, pretty good. Social stability is B. Former British colony. Food independence, C. It's a Caribbean island. Energy independence, D. Military power, C. It is a pretty average Caribbean island, but it's slightly less average than the other Caribbean islands, so that's why it's in C tier instead of B tier. St. Kitts and Nevis, another Caribbean island, actually technically 2 islands. Its geographic security is B for that reason, and its government stability is also B because it's a former British colony. Its economic stability is C, whereas most here, let me explain. There's a little story about this. So most Caribbean islands used to be sugar exporters. That's where their economy came from. Then they decided to transition over to service-led economies, mostly tourism and financial services. However, St. Kitts and Nevis kind of romanticized sugar production for some reason, and they refused to give up it, even though it was not economically viable at all. So the government tried to keep it alive through extensive subsidies, but it failed anyway in 2005 and it was shut down. So this has kind of left the nation behind its Caribbean island peers in terms of economic development. But it is currently transitioning to a tourism-based economy, which is why it is a C-tier nation, because it has the potential to become better. Demographics is C, not much to say there. Social stability is B. It's a former British colony. Food independence is C. Yep, it sure is a Caribbean island. Energy independence is D, and its military power is D also, because it does not have a military. All put together, this is a C-tier nation. Alright, St. Vincent's and the Grenadines. Geographic security is B. Yep, it sure is a Caribbean island. Former stability is government stability is B. Yep, it sure is a former British colony. Economic stability is actually D. Subsistence farming is the mainstay of the St. Vincent and Grenadines economy, which is not good. That's really not an economy if it's just subsistence farming. But its demographics is C, pretty standard stuff. Social stability is B. Yup, it sure is a former British colony. And it sure is a tiny island. Food independence is C. It sure is a Caribbean island. Energy independence is D, and its military power is D, because it does not have a military. Okay, those are the C-tier nations. Nations that are wildcard countries. Nations that have the potential to become more stable, to become more economically prosperous, to enhance the well-being of its citizens. However, they also have the potential to become failing states if they mismanage their in the next 10 years, that is, if they mismanage their situation, if they don't play to their geopolitical strengths and weaknesses. However, the next tier is D tier, the nations that are failing states, the nations that had the potential to maybe do better, but made a bunch of misguided decisions. Or nations that just kind of had a bad hand dealt to them and they're kind of not in a good spot. The first D-tier nation is Guatemala, a Central American nation. Its geographic security is C. It's a pretty similar story to many other Central American nations. Not much to say there. Government stability, however, something to say there. So the last president resigned there due to a corruption scandal, and corruption is obviously not very good. And also, this is the real kicker. There was a 4-decade long, not a 4-year, a 4-decade long civil war that ended in 1996. Yeah, 4 decades. Not exactly the beacon of stability. In terms of government. Economic stability is also D. Very slow GDP growth and very high wealth inequality, and it's one of the poorest in Latin America. Half of the population lives below the poverty line. Not a good combination. Very bad D tier economic stability. Demographics is a C tier. Pretty standard, and the population growth is slowing though, so that's not very good. That's kind of bad because its economic growth is also slowing. It's kind of fallen into the middle income trap if the middle income trap was really the poor income trap, because this economy is not even close to that. Social stability, however, is a C, pretty standard for a Central American nation. No significant social unrest, but at the end of the day, it is a former Spanish colony, not a former British colony. So that is why it has a C tier social stability and not a B tier. Food independence, though, is D. Yeah, it imports its food, not much to say. Energy independence is D. Okay. Military power is C. Okay. All that is pretty self-explanatory. Not much to say there, except the fact that Guatemala is our first D-tier nation. Now on to the next D-tier nation, Honduras, another Central American nation. However, it actually has a geographic security of B because it's slightly more hilly and the population centers are further from its borders compared to its neighbors. Government stability, though, is D. It had a 30-year civil war, 3-decade long, which admittedly is not quite the same as a 4-decade-long civil war. But still, it's a D-tier nation because there was a coup in 2009. Not very good. D-tier government stability. Economic stability, also D. Government and poverty and unemployment are increasing. Usually that's not what you want to see in your economy. Most of the economy is based on agricultural exports. Again, not very good. And the highest, actually, quick fact about this nation, it has the highest income inequality of any Latin American country. Not good. Demographics is D. It is in the phase 3 population model, but it does not have any economic growth. Phase 3 is basically when population growth is slowing and beginning to inverting and beginning to go into an aging population. So not having any economic growth in that situation is very bad. And social stability is C, former Spanish colony. Food independence is F. Yeah, it imports more than half of its food. Not very good. Energy independence is D, and its military power is C. Not much to say there. Nicaragua. Okay, geographic security B is kind of similar to Honduras in that respect. Government stability is D. Again, there was a 3-decade-long civil war in this country from 1960 to 1990. Not good in terms of government stability. And also, there are no term limits there, and the legitimacy of the 2016 election in that country is disputed by the international community. It was the president's there, his 3rd term, and he refused for there to be international monitoring of the election. Pretty sketchy. D-tier government stability. Economic stability D. The economy is mostly based on subsistence agriculture and agricultural exports. Not very good. It also has additional problems. It has the same problems that most of the other Central American nations have. Demographics D. It is also in the phase 3 of its population growth. No economic growth. Social stability is C. 80% of so 80% of indigenous people in Nicaragua live below the poverty line, which actually makes up 5% of the population there. But at the end of the day, it is still a Spanish colony, and it kind of has that same Spanish model. Could be bad, could be good, or actually it really can't be good, but it could be improved is what I'm saying. So it's C tier. Food independence is D. It imports most of its food. Energy independence is D. It imports most of its petroleum. Military power is C. There you go. And finally, our one and only failed state in North America. And that failed state is Haiti. Where to start? Well, let's start with geographic security, like always. It's actually C tier. Haiti is on an island, but they share that island with a nation that is more powerful than they are, which is the Dominican Republic. So it doesn't quite earn the title of B tier. Government stability is D. It has a long history of civil war, insurrection, and conflict. In terms of economic stability, F. Haiti does not have an economy. Most of its GDP comes from foreign aid, and obviously the situation there is very dire. It's very bad for the people living there. Obviously, the Haitian earthquake kind of kills what there was left of the Haitian economy. Not very good. Demographics is D. It is in its phase 3 model of population growth, and there's no economic growth, and furthermore there are people fleeing the country because of the situation there. Social stability is D. There is tensions between mulatto and black Haitians, and there was also protests throughout Haiti demanding the resignation of the current president. Not very stable situation, to say the least. Food independence is also F. It imports most of its food, and there are issues with famine there right now. It's not good. Don't want to say it lightly, but it's F tier. There isn't much else to say. Energy independence is also, or it's not also, but it is D because it imports most of its energy. And finally, military power is also D. It does not have an armed force other than its Coast Guard and police force. So, yeah, there you go. There's the only F tier nation.